So here's your synopsis for book 1 of 2 of the Stonewater Kingdom duology. And this book drops us in to the Ashland Cathedral, where we get to meet our heroine, Sybil. But we will call her, for now, Diviner number 6. After drawing the short straw, it is determined that she will be the one who has to divine for the new boy king, Benedict Castor III. Inflamed by the foulest night in all the realm, and inspired by her fellow diviners, 6 decides to sneak out for an evening of debauchery. But when her fellow diviners go missing thereafter, 6 seeks out the help of the king, and she discovers secrets that are long kept as she unravels the mystery of Ashland Cathedral. Alright, Bookish Baddies, the genre is a gothic romantasy. And while normally I don't get into trigger warnings because I don't tend to read a lot of dark romance, I will say that if you are listening to this and you haven't perchance read the book and you just felt like listening, there is one piece of trigger warning that I will offer to you, which is that this book has recurring depictions of drowning. So if that is something that is sensitive for you, or if it is a fear that you have, just know that going into this book, or know that going into this podcast, is something that they talk about and that we will be talking about on the podcast. All right, judging the cover. So on the cover of this book, we see 6, or Sybil. She's underwater. Her eyes are covered by her hair, like sort of like an etheric, like when you're in the water and your hair's doing the floaty thing, like her hair is kind of floating over her eyes. So her left side on the book cover is covered in gossamer, which this is what is so fascinating to me, because in spirituality, your left side is your yin or your feminine energy, and then on her right side, she is covered in her armor, which is her masculine side. And I just thought that was something interesting and like a little intentionality that went into perhaps that decision. So left side is her divining robes, right side is her armor, these sort of old and new pieces of self, the yin and yang that is Sybil. And then there are also moths that are sort of floating around on the page, on the cover, and then there are flowers. Now, originally, I was like, what kind of flowers are these? And I was trying to figure it out, and I don't think we know the answer to that yet, because I think this is part of the fetid flowers that are in the spring that she consistently drowns in, right? Looking at the tropes for this, I would say found family, reluctant, allies, 2 lovers. They're not quite enemies, but I suppose this is going to probably get tagged as like an enemies to lovers book, but they're not quite enemies. I would say they're like reluctant allies from the very beginning, 2 lovers. And trial by combat. Lots of trial by combat, lots of trial by fire, like that internal fire. So if that's your thing, cool. There's a lot of it in this book. All right, let's jump into this week's time frame, where we will dive into our key feminist themes, history, and cultural context. When I concluded this book, normally I would say I would shut the book, but I am almost always reading on my Kindle. So when I pushed the button on my Kindle, which doesn't have the same effect as like saying, hello, I closed my book. Just a few hours ago when I was writing this, there was one thing that really stood out to me as far as like a big overarching theme that Sybil is going through on her journey, and then that is the archetype of the martyr. Now, let's start by defining what martyr is. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a martyr is a person who voluntarily suffers death as a penalty of witnessing to and refusing to renounce a religion, a person who sacrifices something of great value, and especially of life itself, for the sake of principle, and a victim, somebody who is a great or constant sufferer. Okay, so now let's talk about then how that is defined in the book, because in her initial showdown with the abbess, at this point, Sybil has divined for Rory with the assistance of the gargoyle. And to this, the abbess says, "Do you think me oblivious, that I was unaware of your little jaunt to Colson Fair, or that I had not noticed that you dream twice as much as the other diviners? You are at war with yourself, 6, always thinking yourself stronger than them, better than them, martyring yourself for them." Her shroud rippled as she shook her head. "But I know you, my special girl, and I know beneath it all you resent them, wishing yourself half as bold as them." So I think that this is really interesting, and I think it sets us up to understand that martyr is an archetype that is familiar to many, many women, especially to moms and to other femme-leaning folks. There is something that has evolved over time from an archetype to a societal expectation, particularly in Western culture. And I love that they specifically use this language of martyr because this is going to become relevant as far as like an overarching theme or story that we are getting with religion in the context of six, knowing that the idea of martyr as it is relevant to the story, considering that the story is centered around like what is religion and how does it unfold in our lives. I think that this is such an interesting thing to pose and such an interesting thing for women in particular who are familiar with this archetype. Particularly, I was interested in the evolution of this archetype. But my gentle research led me to Marie-Louise von Rons, who studied collective unconsciousness and specifically studied collective unconsciousness in relation to fairy tales and how it gets portrayed in fairy tales and what it means for folklore and fairy tales to be passed through different spaces and places and time. And what is this book, The Knight and the Moth, if it is not a fairy tale, perhaps a cautionary tale, but are not all fairy tales cautionary tales anyway? Marie-Louise studied Saint Perpetua in particular, who was quite literally a martyr during the early persecution of the church in Africa in roughly the year 203, which is a wild number to think about considering that we are like thousands of years beyond that at this point, right? Before her execution, Perpetua had a bunch of visions that were reported and then later analyzed by Jungian psychologist von Franz. The examination includes an exploration of Perpetua's martyrdom and how her embracing her death was the ultimate spiritual evolution. Very Jesus-esque, kind of a little creepy, and it is quite foreboding for our dear Sybil. Because what is this going to mean when she has to be somebody who, in the face of creating a new religion, after having everything that she believed about her reality and the omens and what she knew of herself as somebody who was divining and a centerpiece of the religion of this kingdom that they live in, for her to then be asked by the end of the book to like go and start a new religion and be the center of it again in a different way, the same thing but a different story, and just using that money to fill somebody else's pot instead of filling, Aisling Cathedral's pot. And when we go back to the definition, a person who voluntarily suffers death for refusing to renounce a religion. So if we sort of flip that just a little bit, right? A martyr of her own beliefs, somebody who is not going to renounce her belief system, even if it is not religious, in order to further along Benji's story. And really, I thought about this a lot. Without any of those people there, without Rory or Maud or the gargoyle, he really has no looming threat to like keep her in line. And perhaps it's a mistake and perhaps something that we'll see where Sybil's not quiet, she's not meek, she's not modest. So having nothing as sort of like leverage to keep her in check, I think is really interesting. And what is that going to mean? Because that means she might be able to get away from being super connected to whatever religion he decides to create. And so she offers herself up, but she's looking at death anyway without that Stonewater. So I'm not sure that she values her life enough to not be willing to die in order to sort of completely dismantle the system and structure that is Stonewater Kingdom. The phrase martyr started quite literally as a death for one's religious beliefs. And I suppose that is also true for Sybil. I don't think that they say it directly, but my interpretation of her drowning is that she is having a near-death experience. And then she's being resurrected based off of the fact that, I don't know, it's the spring water and the spring water creates eternal life, or if she just loses consciousness and then comes back. I'm not really sure because it's not quite clear because she's being pushed and held into the water And multiple times there have been like depictions or writing of like bubbles coming out of her mouth. So she's swallowing it to a certain degree. So is it that she is swallowing it and then after a period of time bringing her back? Or I'm not sure. But my interpretation either way is that she is having a near-death experience, if not even a death and rebirth experience. Though later they say the water can only bring you back once, because when the abbess says she snapped the necks of the other diviners, she's like, there's no coming back from that. So I'm not sure if it's also the type of death that one experiences that can be healed or completed through the process of rebirth that comes from the spring or the magic of the spring in that way. But these are all questions that I'm hoping get answered in book 2. I suppose it's also important to question how credible anything that the abbess says and whatever knowledge that she offers us, because the abbess is the first one to say to tell a story is in part to tell a lie. And so we know that everything that she is saying is not quite true. And so I don't know how credible of a source she is, because perhaps breaking their necks and giving them spring water would have brought them back to life. We don't really know. We kind of have to take her at face value until we get more information, which I'm hoping that we get more information in book 2. Either way, the phrase martyr has evolved over time, and now we use martyr not necessarily in a religious context, although is often used in a cause or a plight, right? Like, oh, we don't want to kill that person because that will make a martyr out of them. So we do still use it in a context of like making a point of something, but I would say this idea of the archetype of martyr is more akin to describing a victim or someone who is suffering at the expense of something or someone else. Most of my research around the archetype of the martyr led me back to Carl Jung. And I take this with a grain of salt, and you should too, because this next tidbit came from Reddit, but I couldn't help myself based off of the content. So on Reddit, Wanderer701, this is a post from 3 years ago, says, the martyr, and they are talking about it very specifically from like the Jungian perspective. The martyr corresponds to Pisces in astrology and hanged man in the tarot. It is a form of wise self-sacrifice and devoted to one's ideals that regardless of what the external world will bring, one's inner world maintains its devoted will. The death of such individuals means that its devoted character paid off. Not only a physical death, but the death of one's ego. Usually this archetype structure is strong with those individuals who are persecuted by opposition that are trying to keep one blind or in the dark. These are usually introverted while they recollect their will and their fate, and then their extroverted character blossoms, bringing with it such uprising, a set of projects and ideals that will liberate those in the dark. So first and foremost, as a metaphysician, okay, my full-time job being an astrologer and a tarot reader and all that fun stuff, as somebody who has been working with these tools for 16 years of my life, Pisces is an interesting correlation here, because Pisces as an archetype in the zodiac is the priestess, or a woman who divines God, right? A woman who divines source or spirit or ether, whatever we want to call it. But her archetype is the priestess. So it's also interesting that this idea of martyr, somebody who is connected to a religious or a source, a universe of some capacity, is being correlated to Pisces and being correlated then to the martyr. And then it is interesting to me that it is also correlated with the hangman in tarot, because in the hanged man card, there's in the conventional deck, which is Rider-Waite, it's like the OG tarot deck. It's like the standard operating tarot deck of tarot at this point. So in that deck, in Rider-Waite, in the hanged man card, he's hanging upside down, he's hanging by his foot, and the crown of his head is illuminated. So there is something about the card that is connected to perspective, that is connected to sort of like the head rush that you get if you do like an inversion in yoga, where there's almost like a clarity or a dawning. So there is something about both of these that is connected to our top chakra, which would be the crown chakra, or the piece of us that is connected to our higher self. So I loved this Reddit post. I loved that it was connected to this particular version. I love that there is a look at the metaphysical components and what that will mean. And this idea of, an oppressor trying to keep people in the dark, and the martyr being somebody who illuminates that or brings light to that. And there are many things that are being kept in the dark about Aisling, about the cathedral, about the omens, and then there will be many things that Benji tries to keep in the dark about this new faith or divination process that they are going to create. There is another group of people that are being completely oppressed in the Stonewater Kingdom, and that is the sprites. And the sprites are being completely oppressed, completely treated indecently, ignobly, if we are going with the language of this world, right? What it will mean in some capacity for Sybil, or perhaps any of our other characters, perhaps Rory or Gargoyle or Moth, to be a martyr for their cause, that they are people who can also stand up for this other group who they witness being oppressed throughout the book. So I thought that was really interesting and something that I hope we can think about as we move through. In another article, separate article, not Reddit, okay, from the Jungian Light, it's titled The Martyr Complex, Selfish or Selfless. And the article claims that the exploration of the phenomenon of self-inflicted suffering reveals a psychological pattern in which individuals intertwine selfish motive with apparent selflessness. And this behavior manifests in both historical sacrifices and daily excessive self-sacrifice without clear benefit, prompting questions about the true nature of altruism. And again, so much of this reminds me of Sybil. Like, what is it getting her to be a better diviner than the other girls? It's not getting her more affection. It's not getting her more of anything, really, other than more opportunities to drown in a pool that she doesn't even freaking like. She doesn't even like dreaming. They say it multiple times, and she says it multiple times in her internal dialogue. And yet she is the one that is sacrificing, but at what cost? She doesn't get out of her service faster by doing it. She doesn't get any more love or affection from the abbess from doing it. She's certainly not liked anymore by the people or by the other diviners for it. The article goes on to say that the value of suffering is profound and often misunderstood. Observations suggest that to be devout, one must be prepared for suffering. This perspective frames suffering not as a misfortune, but as transformative, providing a framework for understanding physical, emotional, and spiritual pain. And I find all of this interesting when considering Sybil and her character and what her motivations are. But I still couldn't help to beg the question, why is martyrdom something that is seemingly an archetype connected to femininity? And in this article from Post Augustum, which discusses the intersectionality between martyrdom and gender, a lot of this article is also then centered back around Perpetua and around her divination diary. So although women were considered to have close spiritual ties with divinity, belief was connected to the idea of feminine weakness. Of course, the most interesting part of that is that the first diviner was Bartholomew, who was a boy. And later, when he shares his story, he imitates the abbess by saying, "What that you were a girl, Bartholomew?" And shortly thereafter, in his own words as Gargoyle, he claims, "Well, I went to go get girls this time since I had proved to be such a disappointment." And a little bit earlier in the book, Sybil says, "Well, it's stated that the abbess chooses girls because we can handle pain better." And I can't help but wonder, was the abbess disappointed in Bartholomew because he begins to quite literally renounce this religion that they have created in the hamlet, a martyr in and of himself, as he bears the weight of the origin or the lie? Or if she would just find girls to be more pliable, that they are more willing to act as martyrs, that they are less in the religious context and more in the ability to endure suffering and victimhood with very little payoff, right? Without clear benefit. And we may never truly know the answer to that because the abbess is dead upon the end of the story. But it is all really interesting to consider. All right, let's dive into our slay by slay, our deep dive of this episode. Deep dive perhaps not being the most considerate of language since our main character drowns over and over and over again. So we start with Ashling Cathedral. Okay, I'm going to go chunk by chunk just like the book does. So we are starting with Ashling Cathedral, which Ashling is Gallic, and in Gallic it means dream or vision. The depiction that we get of Ashling Cathedral is the abbot telling Bartholomew his origin story, and therefore we start to get the precipice or the beginning or the origin of Ashling in and of itself. And then chapter 1 actually opens on Gargoyle, which I think was a really lovely choice because if you've read Rachel's other duology, which is the Shepherd King duology, 1 dark window, 2 twisted crowns, you already know that nobody does a side character like Rachel Gillick. If I'm being honest, I really think that this is Gargoyle's story and we are just learning it through Sybil. She is perhaps a catalyst for the story to continue because, as Gargoyle says, his story is one with a tragic beginning and a desolate, interminable middle. And Sybil is the catalyst that is helping him get to the end of his story as well. So I really feel that in many ways this is actually Gargoyle's story. And so for the book to open up as sort of like there was a boy, his name was Bartholomew. This is, sort of like what happened. And then for the POV to sort of shift or like to come into the present, but it still opens on Gargoyle, to me is like, this is his story. This is about him. He's not a side character. He is the character that we are helping to try to get to the end of their own story. And he just happens to be paired with Sybil on this journey. Okay, another thing that stands out to me from this like stretch of chapters is the gowan flower. So they mention the gowan flower a couple of times, and essentially it is like a Scottish daisy. And I looked up the symbolism, and they represent childhood, they represent innocence, which is so lovely because we have these characters who were foundling children who don't remember their childhood outside of what it was like before they came to Ashling Cathedral. So I love that this Scottish daisy, the gowan flower, represents childhood and innocence. And then in medieval times, they were also associated with infant Jesus, baby Jesus, which again is also interesting considering that Jesus is sort of the masculine version of martyr, right? So interesting that if you look up like the archetype of martyr, that Perpetua is who comes up in the name of Christianity and not Jesus himself. And I found that to be incredibly fascinating. Like one of the things that I found in my deep dive in my little FemFrame opening section. So I'm really excited to explore a little bit more of that because there is definitely some Jesus stuff hanging around in this book. Sybil then is like running out. She's trying to catch sight of the king and the knights and everybody coming in. She grabs an apple. Here we are back in Bible corner. Because if you literally know anything about the Bible, apples represent temptation. They are tied to the Garden of Eden. They are tied to the fruit that Eve, a woman, picks off the tree. And therefore, Sybil, in many ways, is the Eve of our story. She is somebody who is changing the world irrevocably. And is that not what she does? I love that that is her tenacious spirit. And of course, Rory's horse, who is named Big. Shout out to Big. I have a cat named Big. It's my newest cat. I found her on the street. I thought she was a boy. She's a tuxedo cat. But she was out on the street and she would be mewing and meowing and all of that good stuff. And I was like, with a little tuxedo on, that little man out there is Figaro. So I named her Figaro. And then I actually, when I got her to come into my house, because the universe has blessed me with 3 cats, When I took her to the vet, they were like, she is in fact a girl. So we just cut off the Figaro, the Uro, and we've just been calling her Fig. Anyway, shout out to Fig. I was so happy to see this on page that Fig was a horse and a character. Is not a main character, but as Rory's horse, I'm hoping that we will see more of Fig next book. So Fig as the horse that then stops and is eating her apple that just got tossed off the top of this wall, that he is delayed coming in, and she is delayed because she's kind of like watching this spectacle of the horse eating her apple. To me, that was indicating that Rory is going to be her temptation and vice versa. And that is so true from like the very moment that they meet. And this is right here. They're meeting sort of over the wall. It's like a Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo kind of moment. She's looking over the wall at him, and she's like, there's no warmth in his eyes. And she is above him looking down, and he is down looking up, and he like, in awe, like it seems, takes off his helmet, is looking at her. And then she's like, I can see his eyes, and I can tell this dude does not like me. And she tries to have some banter with him, and he's like not having it, like shuts it down. And then Gargoyle comes out to get her, and, you know, Fig and Rory keep going on their merry way. But we learn sort of here that the gargoyles are described as they're not quite human, not quite animal. They're sort of a mix of the two. Obviously, that's something we want to keep in mind since we learn information about this as we go through the book. So we get the first information. We also get the first mention here of Sybil being a martyr in these beginning chapters. I knew what she was thinking. Sybil says, I knew what she was thinking. It's what all of us were thinking. We also learn that they are not able to keep their names when they come and do their tenure at Ashling Cathedral, that they are assigned numbers, and that this is just one of many ways that the abbess is trying to keep them, you know, inhuman, that she is trying to dehumanize them, trying to keep them separate from their humanity. And this is, of course, important because the abbess is literally the architect who is turning these diviners into gargoyles, people who are not quite human, but not quite animal. They're made of stone. So, like, trying to disconnect them from their humanity is a part of a test that she is trying to see, like, who's made for this gargoyle life and who's not. We also get the first mention of Sybil being a martyr here. She says in her internal dialogue, I knew what she was thinking. It's what all of us were thinking. It's why we play the same game 100 times before. I didn't want to be the one to dream. We also get the first mention of Sybil being a martyr in this first scene of them trying to decide who's going to be the one to find for the king. And Sybil intentionally draws the short straw. She intentionally does it. And 4 is like, well, just as well 6, because you're the favorite. You never thrash in the water. She is like ever obedient, never complains, just does as she's told and wants to do it to the best of her ability without creating quite literally like any waves, even in the pool. Like, it's so fascinating, but she draws the short straw on purpose. She pays attention. She said there's a distinct pattern in their tattered yellow tips, and I'd chosen the short straw. We then meet Benedict. He is very green. He doesn't ride with an iron spine the way that his predecessor, King Augur, does. She even goes on to say, indeed, King Castor seemed slightly bent in his saddle, creaking in his armor as if unaccustomed to its grip, like a squire playing dress-up. And this is so interesting because so much of this book is about identity. So much of this book is about knowing who everyone is at the start and knowing where they end up, because every single character goes on such an incredible and unique journey, and it's going to be critical to setting us up for understanding what's going to happen in book 2. So even at the end of this book, Sybil has a thought that's like, he doesn't look so green anymore. Every single Hamlet that we've gone through has fortified him, and he's not necessarily gained any particular skills that are necessary, but he has gained that strength and spine. She even says when she sees him later with the other knights and she's going to meet Rory at the beach, she's like, he's not drinking, he's standing up taller, he looks a little bit more convicted and like sure of himself, a little bit more confident. So it's important that we sort of see him here like a king, like he's literally bent over in his saddle. He looks like a squire playing dress up. He doesn't look kingly. He doesn't look noble. He doesn't look the part. He sort of looks like he's trying to play the part, and that's important because he's still doing that at the end of the book, but he's doing it much better, and at least he has an angle, and at least he has an understanding of what he needs to sacrifice in order to get him to the place he would like to be, where he thinks he would like to be. So when we meet Sybil, she is working hard. She is choosing to martyr herself for the other diviners. She is electing to divine, and she does all of this without complaint. She does it with perfection. When we meet Rory, he shows an immediate disdain for Sybil, right? He doesn't know her, but he's showing an immediate disdain for her, no warmth in his eyes. So we see that he is somebody who doesn't believe in any of this. He's somebody who doesn't subscribe to the omens and to what they stand for. And when we meet Moth, she's somebody who, like, is cutting down the sprite. Anyway, it's important for us to see where all of these characters start, because as they go through their journey over the course of the book, it becomes really poignant about what their point A to point B was, at least in this book. Gargoyle, though, is my favorite character. I think he is maybe literally my favorite character ever. He's definitely going to be my favorite character written for 2025. I think the character of Gargoyle was a laugh out loud funny in a way that I don't often laugh out loud in books. And he is not only that, but he is often providing us with a ton of wisdom as well. And he's a protector, and he's compassionate, and he's loving, and he is driven by purpose. Like, he is so lovely and rich as far as a character goes, and I'm happy to see what his journey is in the next book. I love him so much. Literally, right in chapter 1, the banter that he has with Sybil was perfect. She says, "Apologies, I was chastising an idiot," and she's talking about Rory as she's looking down over, and Gargoyle responds to her, "A happy pastime, as you've proven to me on many occasions. But the king is upon us with nary a warning, the utter gall of men." So not only am I laughing because he's like, yeah, I consistently have to chastise you, the idiot, but also then, like, he is just like a girl's girl, even though he's clearly meant to be a male character. It was an insta-love for me and him. I love him so much. The king and his crew are not really here for a divination. They are here to steal the spring water in pursuit of their larger mission, which we know by the end of this book, by even like the middle of this book, that their larger overall mission is that they are trying to kill the omens and take up the mantle. And we'll talk about that more as we go through, but that's really why they're here. They're not really interested in a divination. And this is somewhat comforting, but it's also uncomforting because later we learn that the abbess controls the divination. So presumably she is dictating all of the bad omens that emerge in Sybil's dream for Benji. And judging where we end off at the end of this book, I don't know that that's necessarily untrue. He got 5 bad omens, and then he does a bunch of bad stuff that is not really in, like, the laws of karma, balance, magic, right? Like, not really fortuitous. And we don't really know because the magic of this world hasn't actually really been defined yet. So we know that there is magic in the spring water. And we know that the things that are carved of it, that anything that is carved of the limestone is magical. And that's where these 5 tokens, these 5 objects of stone come from. So we do know that there is magic in this world, but we don't necessarily understand the system of what it is. And that's important for us to remember, because just because the abbess was the one who was controlling the dreams doesn't mean that this divination and this idea of, like, you got 5 bad omens isn't something that will come to fruition for Benji either way. So let's dive into the story that the abbess then tells before Sybil goes into the divination. It starts with a quote: "The old stories vary, of course, but in one way they are all alike. Trom was filled with monstrous creatures, sprites who roamed the hamlets. Folk tried to fight them, but the hamlets were not unified, floundering without gods, without divine principles, without a ruler. And when none of those things exist, there are inevitable tragedies." So my understanding is that with her form of magic in the spring water, that she then created the omens. And when she did that, she was essentially creating a way to combat the sprites. That is sort of my takeaway from the first thing, that like the sprites were bad. People could not unify over it. And so I gave them something to unify over by creating this thing. And that these were people who went and riled up the people of their hamlet to kill sprites, because even the one who is most connected to compassion, which is the Heartsore Weaver, says, like, for many years I was devoted to this idea of being an omen, and I led my people, and I would use my loom, and I would go and kill sprites. So, like, what is the abbess or like Ashling's beef with the sprites? Like, what is the deal with the sprites? Obviously, this is something that they were setting up for book 2, but we can presume that that part of the story is somewhat true, that she set all of this up because of the sprites. And to me, that means that there is something in the magic system that is going to be explored that is connected to the sprites. And the fact that the abbess is the one to consistently starve people, both literally and like metaphorically in this book. And the fact that the sprites are starving from hamlet to hamlet is pretty indicative to me that she set the system up that way. That starvation is clearly her cruelty of choice. It's clearly a method of cutting somebody off at the knees in order to keep people to obey. And so why doesn't she want the sprites healthy? Why doesn't she want them well? Why does she want the people and the sprites sort of at war with each other? And what does that mean for the magic system of this world? Because I think that is something that we need to keep in the back of our mind as we go into book 2. She then, in this story, introduces the diviners through the partial story of the dreamer. She's only telling us the story of Bartholomew, but she's not saying his name. She's not giving us the full details. But when she describes herself as an omen, when she's describing the moth, when she is describing the moth, she claims the moth is mercurial, distant, never to be known even by diviners. And this is right after she says that the moth appears after you're born or before you die. And for the diviners, at least, this is totally true, because they bear no memories of their time before their tenure at the cathedral. So when they're taken in, are quite literally the first thing that they are seeing is her face when they are coming back to life, because she's putting the spring water in their mouth, right? And then they're coming out of whatever death state or sick state they are in. So she is quite literally there when they are born. And again, for the diviners, she's the one that's taking the loom, going into their room, taking them and snapping their necks. So she is appearing quite literally right before they die. And on an even smaller scale, if divining in and of itself is a near-death experience or a death and rebirth experience, she's the one that's pushing them under the water. And those who don't get an ultimate death, those who do not die and get sent to the omens as like a gift of food, those are the ones who experience a death of self in another kind of way, because they lose their human body and they are transformed into a gargoyle. And so she is quite literally somebody who is there for their death and their rebirth for these diviners in some capacity or another. The story ends by saying that the king's knights were tasked with defending the faith as well as defending the hamlet against sprites. So once again, is all of this full story to starve the sprites out in some way, to use the sprites as a form of deflecting so that something else isn't uncovered. There is something to the sprites here that has not been uncovered yet. And is all of that to protect like the water, the spring water from the sprites? And if so, like protect the sprites from what? Protect the spring water from what? And then Sybil divines. And this is something that I found really interesting in this book, because there is something that is like in the collective consciousness, and I don't know what this is, and I didn't do any research on it because I'm not sure, given the nature of my work, that I necessarily want to know the answer to this. So there is something about like drowning and psychic abilities. And I say that because it's really out there in media in like the past couple of years. So for those of you who are bookish baddies, okay, if you read Crescent City 3, there is a scene or a group of people who divine or have like psychic insight. I forget what they're called in that book, but they're in these like essentially like water tanks where they're just consistently hooked up in these water tanks. And this is also true in like Stranger Things, right? Like she needs to be in the deprivation tank. She's got the sensory deprivation tank where she's floating. She's like in water to a certain degree, and like oftentimes in her psychic divinations or when she's going into the upside down in like her mental space, like it's wet, very, very wet there. Like she's landing in something wet. So that's like something that was also on my mind. And then if anyone ever saw BA, which was a show that Netflix did that I really, really loved. It had 2 seasons, and both seasons were so brilliant, and I was super excited to see where it was going, and then it got canceled. But in that show, too, they are in water tanks. They are essentially being drowned in order to have a near-death experience, and they are part of a scientific study where they are studying the brainwaves and what happens when you are having a near-death experience and what that means. And the water and drowning is a part of it there too. And so, like, what is this idea of drowning and psychic abilities? And here it is again in this book where she needs to be pushed under this very specific water stream to drown herself in order to have these divinations that she is connecting to. So let's talk about Aisling Springs for a second. Let's talk about the lime water. I don't know if it's called the Aisling Springs or like the limestone springs, but let's talk about it for a second because I'm also going to make a theory here about book 2. So as they travel through the hamlet, we are told time and again that these sprites eat plants. They're herbivores, and they're resorting to eating humans against their own nature, sometimes even described in this book, because they're hungry, they're starving, like they're looking for food. They're literally visibly being starved. And there is something about the spring water that is described as like rotting flowers. And I am wondering, like very specifically, it is said its water was oily, what is that? Why? And dark, also why? And smelled of rotting flowers. So first and foremost, we don't really hear of any sprites in Aisling. The only time that we hear of sprites in Aisling are referring to the gargoyles, but we learn that the gargoyles aren't sprites, they're humans. So I think that the water either drowned the sprites or quite literally drowned the food that they were connected to, because they consistently eat plants and it smells like rotting flowers. What is being put down there? And like, if we know that the plants are also used in the other hamlets for other things, and at least to the point of in the Chiming Woods, like we know that idleweed is used medicinally and like can also be ingested by humans. So like there is something about idleweed that we know, and something about this plant, whatever the plant is that is in this water, that have like a mind-altering effect, and what that actually means, right? So do these other plants also have mind-altering effects? Are they something that provides magic? These types of plants provide magic to different sprites. And like a couple of times as we go through the book, gargoyle eats flowers, like looks at a flower, picks a flower, eats a flower, and is looking at all of this stuff. And I'm wondering, like, why does this spring of water smell like rotting flowers? And when flowers are so important and plant life is so important to the sprites of the other hamlets, like what is in this water and why are there no sprites in the door? So that's heavy on my mind, right? All right, and then we get some time with the diviners hanging out all together. And one of the things that I love about this book is that the diviners are religious figures, but they are not necessarily modest and they are not necessarily demure. They are revered, they are certainly pious, but they are not necessarily these like neat characters or like weaklings or, you know, very quiet and like demure. Demure is the right word. So very mindful. They're very demure, right? One of the quotes that really stood out to me here is, "There is a reason we diviners were kept out of sight after a dream. It was not worthy of our image, our station, that we be seen as frail. that dreaming of the gods was in any way diminishing. So she even says it like, we're not supposed to get sick in front of people. That's why the gargoyles hide us away and make sure that we're safe and okay back here until we're good to go, because people aren't supposed to see us getting sick. We're not supposed to be seen as frail. We are like the people who are the most connected to the gods in this world, and therefore we are the strongest that there was. Like, we're not frail for divining. We're not weak for divining. We are boss-ass bitches for divining. And I love that she says that, like, it's not worthy of our image or our station, and yet here she is, like, growing up on Rory's boots, and that's not acceptable. But the idea that they can go off to the glen and have a little fuck, or that they can drink, or that they can smoke, that they are able to do these other things that are conventionally very unmodest, not connected to nunnery or monastery life at all, is so interesting to me. Like, that would be a bigger fault that she is throwing up on his shoes than it is that, like, she ends up smoking a bunch of weed later. And then we get Rory and Sybil's first initial meeting post-vomit. He is the foulest knight in all of Traum. Now, Traum is a German word, which I will not try and do a German accent here, okay? And it is also a German word for dream. So we have Aisling, which means dream. We have Traum, which means dream. We're just going in heavy with the dream symbolism in the background. And while they're having this brief interaction, when she's up on the wall, it's the first time that she makes a request of him. And while they have this brief interaction up on the wall, like this moment right here outside of the Diviner's Cottage, this moment right here out of the Diviner's Cottage is the first time that she makes a request of Rory, that she asks something of him. And she says, step back. And Rory takes 3 steps back. So from the very first face-to-face conversation that they have, Rory is already willing to comply with the thing that he says that is his tagline throughout this whole book. I'd do whatever you asked me to do. I would do whatever you asked me to. This is his middle name. I would do whatever you asked me to, in quotes, okay? So you're going to hear me say this a lot because I love it. It's not something that she earns throughout the book. It's something immediate with the two of them. She says step back and he steps back, and everything that she asks thereafter of him, every request that she makes of him, every interaction that they have together, he complies with everything except one, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So Rory is Sybil's grand awakening, and vice versa. They are here to awaken each other. They are here to spark a flame in each other. They are here to be mirrors, but also foils. And there is something that they can gain together by what they will share over the course of this book. And it's a beautiful love story in so many ways. And I'm excited to see how it evolves in book 2, knowing that it's duology. But in this very first scene, he is essentially poking at her. You know, he's like testing the armor where it's weak. And he says, he's asking her all of these questions, and she's being really reluctant to answer, as she should be, because she doesn't trust him yet. And she keeps saying, like, why? And he goes, well, Benji wants to know. So just like I said earlier, that they're not really here to have a divination, that they're really just there to get the spring water. This is a fact-finding mission. You know, she throws up on his shoes, and that happens in front of Benji. And I feel like Benji is like, go on out there and do some fact-finding and see what you can get out of this diviner. And he says it quite honestly. Like, Benji wants to know. This is where this, you know, poking and prodding is coming from. I think Benji wants to know how much the diviners know about Aisling and whether or not there's information that he can gain out of this conversation to benefit, you know, bringing down the cathedral in the end. But when Sybil tells Rory to have some fucking deference, I think that is the moment that he knows that Sybil will be the altar in which he prays. And then later on, Maud is like, when he came back from that interaction, he smoked a whole branch of idle weed, and I knew that he was fucked either way. And this is because she gets under his skin, because she is forcing him to look at something, and vice versa. That's why she is so in her head later on and can't get him out of it. And that's why she decides to, like, go have a little romp in the glen with Hamlin. So I already love that this is sort of starting here, that she's calling him out on his lack of faith, and, that his faith ends up building in her. It's her spirit, it's her conviction in who she is, not necessarily what she is a symbol of, that I think Rory can really respect and understand, and that is the type of person that he wants to commit to and be loyal to. Somebody who is convicted in what they believe in and what they stand for. And obviously he doesn't know where she really fits in on this. Like, is she in on this team or is she out on this? But as he comes to learn about her and know her, and he understands that this fighting spirit that she has is just something within her that is, that is worth of deference, is, I think, exactly why Rory falls in love with her. He then asks her, "What's your name?" And this becomes a very important question as we go through the story, because not just here, but the power of everyone's name in this story. Benji lessening his title by allowing people to refer to him as his nickname. Sybil continues to call Rory in her head up until a certain point, but out loud to his face either calls him Roderick or calls him Knight or a number of other foul things, but she mostly calls him by his last name, Mendacious. And the gargoyle's calling everyone Bartholomew in order to hold on to his own name. Benji refuses to call Sybil her name. He commodifies her. He continues to commodify her even though he knows her name, even though he can give him permission to call her Sybil by the end of his book. By sort of like the middle of this book, a little bit later than that, but she says, like, "Call me Sybil," and he continues to call her either Diviner or call her Six. So he refuses to use her name and to humanize her in any capacity. He just continues to modify her, and her name is a weapon of that as we go through this book. So in this first pass, at the very start of the story, when they are first connecting Rory and Sybil, it is so significant because we are recognizing here the power that a name hold. And this is true in fairy tales, right? If you think about like a Rumpelstiltskin, knowing the name is what gives Rumpelstiltskin the power. And if you think about something like the Crucible, where we get a John Proctor who is like, "Because it is my name, because I cannot have another, I refuse to sign my name away because it's the only one I have." That there is something to the idea of what it is to be called by our name, and what our preference of that is, and the way that it can be used in tenderness and in love and in connection, and the way that it can be used in separation, and what that will mean for our story moving forward. A question I ended up having from this conversation was, can only the foundlings drink the spring water? And if so, and what in this story is the definition of foundling? We don't really know what that is. We hear that some of them are orphans, but not all of them. And so, like, what in this story is a foundling, and why is it that foundlings in particular are able to drink the spring water, and can they be the only one to drink spring water? And then Rory points out that, like, being a diviner is sort of dehumanizing. And again, this is the word I want to use because they quite literally are stripped of their humanity as they are turned into gargoyles. So I just love this because, of course, this is the point that the abbess is trying to reach, is to disconnect them from their humanity in any context. But Rory calls it out so plainly. He's like, the abbess strips you of your name, face, clothes, and distinction. And this is something that Sybil is going to have to sit with and contend with over the course of this book and over the course of her journey. And so that is the end of our first section, Aisling Cathedral. And now on our journey, we will travel to Coulson Fair in the Hamlet. Their creed is the only portent, the only prosperity, the only god of men is born. And really here, I kept thinking about the end of this book, like the only god of men is we, which is something that I think the book is really interested in exploring, because it's not just coin. Even though coin is a part of it, it is the plants that the sprites eat that they refuse to give to them, that like Sybil again and again is like, surely the answer to this isn't killing them. Surely the answer is feeding them. Like, why don't you just feed them? Isn't there enough? These are plants. Can't we grow more? Like, she is somebody who is acknowledging that to the benefit of people and to the harm of sprites, are we harvesting these things, and that's greedy. There's something about that that's really, really greedy. And, that there is a system and structure in place that keeps certain people in titles and other people out of them. Ashling Cathedral sits sort of high and mighty over the rest of the town, right? Like old and disapproving on top of the hill, looking over the rest of this kingdom as sort of like the creme de la creme, and that there is this system and structure and what that means, and that more than anybody, the abbess is the most greedy of all. So it's not really about money for the abbess, although obviously there is money in it, but there is something more than that. It is the power of running the whole thing and having power over the whole thing and what she has created over the whole Stonewater Kingdom and what that means. So even though they say that they created the only god of men is coin, I really think that it's deeper than that. This is the first time, by the way, speaking of sprites, that we get any sight of the sprites as they are leaving, okay? And as they're walking through the glen, the knight kills one of the sprites and he says, "Creatures of the land can't be trusted. There's no room for mercy, even for the little ones, large or small, handsome or monstrous. All sprites are violent and impossible to control." They even go on to say, okay, in the same scene, "There's nothing redemptive about creatures who would happily eat you for breakfast." And we know that this isn't true about the sprites because, number one, they are not necessarily violent or impossible to control. They are out of control and acting violently because they are trying to be controlled by starvation, right? And they would happily eat you for breakfast because they're starving. Not necessarily because they want to, but because they're hungry. So they are resorting to the bottom of their totem pole when the rest of the resources that is their food is being used by humans, creatures of the land. So I just love that, and I love the irony of it, and I love this sort of double entendre that is going for. Hamlin and Sybil go off for like this little romp in the woods, okay? And it's because she can't get Rory out of her mind, right? And she's like, "I can't stop thinking about this guy, so I'm gonna go fuck somebody else." And Hamlin says to her, "Imagine the influence being wedded to a daughter of Ashland," which of course is a foreshadow for later and what happens with Benji at the end of the story, and then being forced into like an arranged marriage with him. But let's go back for a minute, because earlier in the story, she talks about how she's had sex with other people before, and then she was having sex one time with this knight who was visiting for another divination, and she's like, "I basically felt like a task on his to-do list. Like, I felt bad that I was an obligation to him." So when Hamlin says, "No one is going to believe I fucked a diviner," what little desire that she already had in her body just like fled in that moment. She completely got the ick because he's commodifying her. Like multiple times in this book, he says like diviners are to be known, but never to be seen, never to be understood. Like diviner in public, human in private. And what that means for her, and to hear it out of somebody's mouth, knowing that they are going to do the most intimate thing together. They are going to sleep together. And for her, maybe that isn't the most intimate thing, but it is an intimate thing that we share with somebody, right? But he is here commodifying her. He's making her a task, essentially, something that he wants to cross off of his bucket list. Like, fuck a diviner, right? You know, spend time with a diviner, hang out with a diviner. Like, he wants it because there's something about it that elevates one's status or stature. And, you know, she tells him no. And when she continues to say no, he then says, "Well, can I at least see your eyes? Can I at least see your eyes? Can I have your name? Something, some token to prove that we were together." And this is just like the worst of it. Like, he can't take no for an answer. He's not about doing this for his pleasure or for hers, but for a story that he hopes to tell other people that has nothing to do with them. Like, this is not about what they're sharing together. It's about like what he's hoping to achieve by telling other people, like, "High five, bro, I fucked a diviner." And this is just so icky and so gross. And, you know, obviously then she's like even more frustrated. The reason why she does this in the first place is to like get over Rory in a particular moment, and ends up with somebody who's so icky and gross. So later on, what I love about Rory then is that he may have his own moral code, that he might not be like loyal or super committed according to Benji to like these rules that are set out by the knighthood, but the ones that he does have internally, whatever his own internal moral compass is, he follows that consistently. So when Hamlin is embarrassed later on, like by all the diviners, they were like, that was kind of quick, that was super fast. Like they're teasing him. And when he's so embarrassed, he like bucks off from his duties. And I love that Rory goes after him and that Maud, somebody who has spent a lot of time with Rory, who loves him, who cares about him, who has nurtured him, who has made him her squire and then turned him into a knight and offered him knighthood, that this person who sees his potential and knows his heart and knows what he truly is internally, who he is inside, that Rory like goes right after Hamlin. He's like, I'm going to get that guy. And Maud follows after him, and it just shows they're so aligned in their values. And this is, again, important for us to understand because the inner circle might look like it includes Benji right now, but it doesn't by the end of this book. And in fact, more and more through the course of this book, Benji separates himself from this inner circle. So this inner circle, this found family, ends up being Rory and Maud and the gargoyle and Sybil, and Benji is there for a period of time, but it's much like the Omens say, like ever a visitor to their greatness, right? Like ever a visitor. And that's what he's doing. He's visiting this found family for just a period of time before essentially he fucks off and does his own thing. And what that will mean for our story coming then. But I love that we just see that Rory has a moral code that he follows it, and that Maud is aligned with that and follows that. So then I was wondering too, like, as Benji starts this challenge up with Rory there and Wholesome Bear, if the challenge is another ploy to get back into Aisling to get more spring water. Like, I am essentially, poking and prodding and teasing at you because I know that you don't believe in any of this, but also, like, go back to the cathedral and have somebody divine for you so that you can get more spring water while they're unconscious. I don't know. But Rory loses the challenge and ends up having to get divine for. And I really want to parse through this content because we learn later that the abbess controls the dreams. So when she isn't there and she's not the one who is leading the divination, and because Gargoyle is then leading the divination, he can then influence the dream. So this is not magic specific to the abbess. This is magic specific to whoever is holding somebody down in the water. I am presuming. Again, we don't necessarily know how this magic works, but that is my understanding of it. So there's this iconic line from Gargoyle as he says, just as well, sometimes Bartholomew, I think her quite a bitch. And he's talking about the abbess, and I literally chortled. I laughed so hard. In this chapter, by the way, which was chapter 7, The Moth, this is the first time that I made a note of any of my suspicion that diviners were being killed off. So Sybil, who Rory claims knows nothing, certainly has no alarm bells going off in her mind every time that Gargoyle makes some sort of offhanded comment along the lines of anything around any of the lore of the diviners. Like, she's not noting any of it. She just, like, brushes right past it. And so in many ways, she is quite naive because it's ringing an alarm bell for me reading it. I'm like, what do you mean when you're gone? Or like whatever he says in that particular part of the chapter. I don't know if it's down. It's like one of the only things I didn't write down in my show notes. But he does say something that causes her to not have a pause and be like, well, what does that mean? And this is what I love when we get a first person experience, because it rings a bell for me and maybe for you, the listener, but it doesn't ring a bell for Sybil. And so she doesn't get to ask these questions until much later on in the book. As Rory and Sybil prepare for their divination, Rory distinguishes that he does believe in the omens, but he does not have faith in the omens. So he's like, no, I believe in them. And we end up finding out that, of course, he believes in them because he worked for one. He worked for the Artful Brigand. But he says, I don't have faith in them. And I think that's an important distinction for him to draw for her and to understand that for her. So once again, Rory, I would do anything that you ask, mendacious, at our service, because Sybil says, I need your blood, you dunce. And he replies, well, surely that's just performative. And Sybil's like, well, if it means something to me, then it's not performative. And what does my baby Rory do? He bites the pad of his thumb, which, like, ow, by the way, because you have to bite your finger, like, pretty hard in order to make it bleed, in order to comply with her request. And then he waits for her permission to ensure that it is enough. And we love a king, or I guess in this case, a knight, who honors consent. He is like the king / knight of consent, and he is somebody who, like, every single time that she says something or asks something of him, he literally follows through with whatever it is that she asks. I would do anything for you. So he hasn't said this to her yet, but I am tracking it as we go through. So she asked for the blood. He gives it to her. And what I love about this particular part of the book and the divination is that when she dreams for the abbess, it is very violent. She is getting battered. She's getting bruised. She's getting harmed. She's in pain. But with this divination, where Gargoyle is leading it, she claims a strange sort of calmness has taken over me, and I kept walking undisturbed through hazy white light. So I just love that she's like calm, she's undisturbed, she's not falling, she's not getting hurt in this dream. And that is a part of the divinations too, that the abbess is controlling that and like putting the diviners in pain through these dreams that she's forcing them to have in their tenure during their time in the cathedral. So I just thought that was really interesting that when Gargoyle's leading it, it's calm, it's serene. She keeps walking in this dream and she reaches a place that is darker and cooler, and it is there that a moth then appears. So I also just love that they're calm and that she's walking and she walks into like a hazy light. Is this Bartholomew dying? And is the moth, which is a symbol of death, okay? If you haven't listened to the Last of Us coverage, have fun, you can go listen to that. We talk about that all over there. So if that is true, right? If the moth is a symbol of death and she is walking from a space, like walking to a light and then walking to somewhere that is colder and darker, meaning like the body starts to cool right after we die, like it's dark because there's no life in us. And then the moth comes, the moth appears, lands on her shroud and begins to pluck it away. Okay, so she remains Sybil in this dream, but just the idea that it's like going over her shroud and it's sort of like picking at the pieces of her shroud. And she closes her eyes as it's doing this, and then she feels the shroud fall away in the dream. And when she opens her eyes, the wings of the moth are covering her eyes, and so she's not looking through her shroud, but she's looking through sort of like the thinness, or like looking through the wings of the moth, like through them, and she's divining through the wings. So through the wings of the moth, she says that she sees the beauty of the 5 hamlets as if I am soaring above them, and then Aisling, lone and gray, looming behind its wall on the shore. The cathedral watched me with eyes of stained glass. Only now the 5 statues of the courtyard were not made of stone. They were human, each holding a distinct stone object. So through the eyes of Gargoyle, or through the divination of like Gargoyle's wishes, we are seeing the truest version that we will know of by the end of the story, of this version of like how the omens came to be.